Tennesseans are telling us they are feeling the punch every time they go fill up the car at the pump, every time they go to the grocery store, every time they go get plants and fertilizer for their summer garden. They are feeling the hit in their wallets because they are paying more for just about everything. So we decided that for this Unmuted with Marsha, that it would be appropriate to have a true economic expert, and she is Executive Director of the Baker Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee, and she also served as the Chief Domestic Economist on President Trump's White House Council of Economic Advisors. Marianne Wanamaker, welcome to Unmuted. We're delighted to have you with us today. Let me start. Inflation, it's at a 40-year high. And we're hearing so much about this. And since the American Rescue Plan came to be, which is what President Biden put in place, inflation has outpaced wage growth. So that means that, as one Tennessean says to me, he runs out of month. He has too much month left at the end of his money every single month. So you look at all of this printing money and all of this excess government spending. So how has that out of control government spending helped to drive up inflation?
Great question. So we teach our undergrads at UT that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. And in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government really took the strategy of pushing money into the wallets of individuals and also into businesses, small businesses and large businesses. And that afforded us a really, really strong recovery. So the United States has the best recovery from the pandemic of any of our peer countries. The flip side of that is that we also have the most inflation of any of our peer countries. And I think there's, as you pointed out, an increasing recognition that we may have overshot on how much money we put back into the economy. And so now the Federal Reserve is having to play a little bit of catch up and try to get inflation back under control.
Well, and people are seeing this, I said, whether it's the pump or the grocery store. And many times Tennesseans will say, hey, you know, they're saying it's 8% inflation, but go with me to the grocery store. And it is much more than 8% when it comes to those consumables. Talk a little bit about that spike that we're seeing in food and in consumables that they're picking up every time they go to the grocery store.
Yeah, food has been a real surprise this year in terms of the increases we've seen. So as you said, 8%, 10% in some food categories. We're looking at higher than 20%. So chicken in particular is up by that much. Last year and the year before, we saw rates of increase that were closer to 3 or 4%. So a really, really different situation this year. And when I think about food prices, both in restaurants and in grocery stores, I think about the three components that make those up. One is labor, just in terms of producing the food and then getting it to the table in a restaurant or getting it on the shelf in a grocery store. And of course, we're undergoing a severe labor shortage in this country. And so the labor component is rising for that reason. Another important input into food costs is energy costs, because we have to transport the food. So we make the food or grow the food in California, but then it's got to get on the shelf in Tennessee, and we burn a lot of gas in the process moving it over here. And so as gas prices rise, food prices rise. And then the third piece is the food ingredients themselves. So you've probably heard a lot about wheat and oil coming out of cooking oil coming out of Ukraine or Russia, that those have been impacted by the conflict there. But there are other parts of the supply chain that are also struggling. And so, for example, in chicken, one of the things that's driving costs right now is an avian flu that has taken hold in the United States. And that, 5 years ago, that would have been a headline. There's just so much else going on right now that's sort of gotten buried. So component parts, labor, transport, and then also just the raw cost of goods, all of that experiencing inflation right now.
And I would add to that, many times we forget about the plastics and the wrappings and the packaging for the food. And much of that comes from the polymers that are there in the hydrocarbons and crude oil. And so when that price goes up on a barrel of oil, it affects the packaging that is going to be on those California grown avocados that are making their way to a Tennessee grocery shelf. So those component parts are a very important part of this. Marianne, another thing that we've heard a good bit about from Tennessee is the cost of housing. And they're looking not only at construction cost, but at rent. And then with inflation, people no longer have disposable income that they're able to save to actually purchase a house. So touch on that sector when we look at the escalation rate in housing costs.
Yeah, it's really a big problem right now, as you noted. So what the origin of all of the housing price increases really, again, kind of back to where we started at the beginning of the pandemic, when the federal government did put all that money in the pockets of households, trying to help them make it through what was a really difficult period of time, some of those households accumulated a lot of cash. And what do you do with a lot of cash? Well, one of the things you can do is make a down payment on a house. And so we saw a surge in demand for housing starting in the middle of 2020 that has really gone all the way through 2021 and maybe even the first part of this year. Now what we're experiencing is a leveling off in demand for housing. So the price of the house itself may not be rising that much anymore, but now what's happening is interest rates are rising. So it wasn't that long ago that Knoxvillians, where I live, could get a mortgage for 3%, 30-year 3% mortgage. And now those rates are above 5%. And if you're buying a $250,000 house, the difference between the monthly payment at a 3% mortgage rate and a 5% mortgage rate is about $300 on a $1,000 mortgage. So it's a huge change in how much it costs in terms of monthly payments for the same house. So again, the price of housing may not change that much right now, but the interest rate increases are going to make it feel like the price of housing is really accelerating. Then on the rental side, we're just not building enough housing, especially in our higher population, higher density locations. The cities in Tennessee all are experiencing a real rise in rental prices, and we've got to do something on the policy side about encouraging more building.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you one more question, and this one is kind of your crystal ball. How long do you expect to see this rise in inflation? Because consumers are beginning to say, where is this going to top out? And how long are we going to have to deal with this?
Yeah, in the last week or two, there's been an increasing amount of data that suggests that we have peaked in terms of the rate of inflation. That doesn't mean that prices are going to come down. What it means is that the growth rate of prices might slow. So instead of seeing 10% increases at the grocery store, hopefully by the end of the year, we're looking at something closer to 4 or 5%. So it's going to feel a little bit better. It's not going to feel a ton better for a while. And of course, I think something we've learned in the last 2 years is be ready for the unexpected. There's just been an inordinate amount of surprise in the economic system. And so even if I can sit here today and say, yeah, I think it's going to get better, of course, something could happen between now and the end of the year that changes that.
Well, we will look forward to your reports. And by the way, our audience, if they want to follow some of your speaking and writing, where are they going to find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter at MWanamak, MWANAMAK.
Wonderful. And you can always find me on social media at Marsha Blackburn or our website, blackburn.senate.gov. Marianne Wanamaker from the Baker Center for Public Policy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.